Welcome, Sarah. It's lovely to have you on the show, talking with poets. I've been doing this for a few months now, and I've practiced on Martin Espada and Mervyn Taylor and some others. Really excited to talk to you about Nothing You Build Here Belongs Here, which, by the way, is the latest, and it's just a stop because there's more to come right from your pen. Tell us about where you are with your poetry practice, and do you write fairly often? Are you obsessive about the muse? Tell us about that, and then I will get to the book.
Did you say am I obsessive about the muse?
Yeah.
Where I am in my practice, to my right, there's a stack of composition books
Okay.
I bought recently. And I opened the one that I was working in, and the last date was June 14th. And I used to have, as of June 14th, a daily writing practice that I would do every morning with a cup of coffee. And I would free write 3 pages in a composition book. And it wasn't poetry, it was just practice, as you say, kind of like yoga or meditation. And I recently took the bar exam. And so that kind of, I don't know, I'm out of shape, to continue with my exercise metaphor.
Right.
Because that was the last entry in this composition book. But last night and today, I've been journaling, not with the same intention that I had been doing that practice, where I got up in the morning and I sat down, and before the day had begun, I it was just sort of prayer in a way, like before anything. I sat at the page, and there was no structure or form to it. It just was a way to put literally the pen to paper every single day, so that if I didn't write a poem, I had written. And literally over the last 12 hours, I've reconnected with these little, I bought new pens, and it feels very much like when you reawaken your body after not having exercised for a long time, or having been ill. I don't know if you've ever had a bad illness where you've been in the hospital for a while, or like broken a leg or something. Then has that ever happened to you, Indran?
No, I've been in the hospital for I can't remember. Something had to be removed. Maybe it was a gallstone or something, and I remember passing a night, but not a serious or long-term thing. Not yet, anyway.
When you break a bone and you have your
right.
cast on for a long time.
That's right. Yeah.
Atrophies. When I was little, I broke my leg and I was in a long cast, and when they took it off, the legs were different sizes. It's quite shocking. So I feel a little bit like that's where I am as a writer.
Well, we're delighted that you're back. That you've got a new set of pens, and that you're journaling. I have to say I know about the other kind of pen that you have, which is the legal pen, right? And equally important and valid, and I've always loved this combination of the poet and the jurist, the lawyer in you. But let's talk poetry now. Tell us about Nothing You Build Here Belongs Here. I mean, this is the book to celebrate today, and not just today. It really is a fine book. It stands out way. It's a bright light in the crowd of books, jostling for poetry books, jostling for position at the subway station. I think your book is illuminating, and what a wonderful, beautiful cover. This, I mean, I just love this. Tell us about why the title, and tell us about the cover, and then we'll get into the contents.
You just held it up, but I can hold it again. These are irrigation circles, and you'll see them if you've ever flown and looked out the window in your airplane when you're flying over both the Midwestern United States and upper Midwest. Use these kinds of circles to farm, and it's just a way to water crops that is unique. And so this is just a view you'll see outside your plane. And so I took this picture on a trip west once, and I was so enamored. I remember looking out the window at the lands, and you'll have to buy the book to see exactly what I'm talking about, but there's cracks in the earth, and beyond just these swaths of irrigation circles, parts of the United States look like, they just reminded me of bodies, like there are these places where it's gray and sort of pale Caucasian colored, and or different colors, and there's cracks, and it looks sort of like the spine is moving over the landscape, and I just was so moved by the vastness, and in some areas how desolate it looked. But then in some small patches here, we had tried to farm by creating these strange circles, which works well. It's a great idea.
Yeah. Do you want
I wrote the poem that is the title to the book, and it's
right.
called "Nothing You Build Here Belongs Here," because the thought that I had was how, in this little flying aluminum bus that I was in, looking out over the earth, and as moving as it is, you and I, Indran, have talked about this, like the view of seeing New York City from the sky, or Washington when you're descending back into DCA or JFK, where it is stunning. But ultimately, it is this spindly little spread of, and it's fragile. Like the cities look so fragile from above, and they really don't belong.
I love that spindle little spread and these fragile cities. Imagine thinking of New York. I used to think of New York as this amazing, the powerful center. I lived in the center of it, as I know you did as well. And I would walk and I would see the World Trade Center towers, and these enormous skyscrapers, and imagine the Empire State Building when it was the tallest building in the world, and yet fell down, in one case by politics, by the attack on the towers, but psychologically, the earth itself, human construction, seems to be cracked, right? We have just seen the building collapse in the middle of the night in Florida, and this is a kind of metaphor. Go ahead.
We've had this bridge here in DC. What was the name of that bridge? Just collapsed.
Yeah. And so in high time that we're looking at infrastructure funding in the government. But why don't you read us maybe 2 or 3 poems from the book to get a flavor? Pick any ones you wish, with the title, poem, or any others, and then let's keep talking. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just start with the title poem since we're talking about it.
Right.
It's written to personify what I've felt looking out the window of the plane. You have this tiny little porthole almost, and honestly, I felt a spiritual connection to the earth at that moment, and this is what I thought she would have said to me at the time, or what I felt she was saying to me. My mountains could care less about you. Steel structures clinging, tendrils rising, curling fingers, desperate, lonely, clutching, dry and desolate. You've buried basements and pools, trying, like only the hairless do, to stay cool, as if heat is a thing you can hide from. There's no road between my breasts. Tremble at the sight, at the tracing of lines, at the endless rising, billowing hills, blanketed Madrean sky islands, tectonic tumbling seams of the Sierra Madre pine oaks peek out, ancient alpine mountains of my desert sea. My arid grasslands cradle, peaks named with expiring words, Oaxaca, Peñaleño, Santa Catalina, cached mercury, tints, dirt hemmed, edges of tan, yellow, and gray, pivoting irrigation centers of green-gray, spitting out dust. And from 34,000 feet, think of me as a woman. Pores leaking salt, exerted, worked, squeezed, ridged and wild. Bodied peaks climbing and falling, pruning the stones, years of water tumbling back to my seas. I am the desert Hera, sucking you dry, absorbing your waterless body into hers, remanding you who came to harvest, to marvel, to take back to your metal coffins you built, to the ground they were mined, for nothing you build here belongs here.
Wow, wow. You know, not just for nothing you build here belongs here is this poem. Really a great, really one of the great poems. It's for the rhythms, for the way you, the staccato, I don't know, the way you move. I mean, what a wonderful reading. I think that's my favorite reading of this particular poem, and I've heard it a couple of times. And I was struck by some of the devices, the poetic devices you use. I mean, things like alliteration, and where was that tectonic tumbling and peaks? Name the let's see, yeah, the peaks and Pinaleño, and then this. I love that, to marvel, to take back to metal coffins you built. The pause and the taking back. You sort of, I could see the taking back. And I'm wondering if we're being taken back, no matter how many poems we write to try and stop our inevitable punishment. We as a human species, Go ahead.
This is a love poem too. Some of we talked about how a lot of these are love poems, but it's sort of a funny, ironic voice too. Like, and this is what I felt sitting in that plane seat, looking out over these deserts, because they were so beautiful, but also so much
death, right.
in them, and what irony, like how we build these, like you mentioned, walking in New York when you are in it feels immense and stunning, but from the sky, or I mean, from another perspective, how fragile.
Inevitably, you mentioned death, you mentioned the fragility. We are, of course, living in this pandemic. It's almost a cliche to mention it, but at the same time, we have to deal with it. We have to address it somehow, absorb it, and it becomes part of our writing practice in a way. And I think this book is also a book in response, or born in this time, a book of this time. So can you speak a little bit about that? Because they're love poems, and they're poems born in the pandemic. And there are these beautiful, really outstanding short lyric poems throughout the book. And so I'm curious to know whether the lyric, the poet in you, and the experimental poet in you, the one, because there are also 2 or 3 poems in this book that are prefigured another book that's coming out of yours called Call Me Spez, right, from Mad Hat later this year. And they'll be in that book as well. So, and then your first book, Reasons for a Long Tomb, the responses to Marcel Duchamp's work. And so you have this sort of artistic dialogue going on in your poetry, where you're responding to whether it's human-made art, or the earth's, the ecology of whether it's whoever designed this ecosystem, whether it's God or or we. So tell us about those poetic choices. Maybe read a couple of those short lyric poems and relate them to the pandemic, because they're also born in the pandemic. Sorry, my question is very broad but I just thought you'd reflect about lyricism, the poetic choices of why those short, tight little poems, and the pandemic. Go ahead.
I think what I hear you asking is, how I use or make fun of maybe things in poetry in a lyrical way. Is that what you're getting at?
Not so
Or
much make fun of, but just you have many resources. I mean, you are a very versatile poet. I mean, you can produce the imagist poem, the lyric poem, but you can also go where no poet has ever gone before, into bytes and and computer language, and so and you dance the poem, but you're fearless as a poet, is what I'm trying to say, that you in experiment. So could you talk about testing the sound barriers of poet, in a sense, crossing conventional lines? Is that helpful? Maybe you can give us an example. For example, I mean, maybe read some of these poems like Boricua or, uh, you know, on the historic register, what WIC will buy. Um, there are many of these on being asked for COVID poems every Friday, kissing nowadays.
I was going to say, I'll start with that one.
Okay, go ahead.
Shortness of it. And just to respond to your question a little bit, I think the way that this book uses COVID poetry and as you were talking, I was thinking about the themes of what this book is or what it uses, because that is something that I do have to market it in some way, right? Like, because Duchamp had, my first book used Duchamp and the structure of the rosary, and that's sort of how I explain it to people when I get the question of what kind of poetry is your poetry. And I think this book is about ghosts and all the poems, whether they're they're songs to lovers or about love, they're skeletons that contain the beating hearts of some ghost. And the COVID poetry is some of it was a reaction to March 2020, what everybody was feeling, which was this like inhale of shock. And then when I edited them in retrospect, there was sort of a ghostly aspect to doing that, because we as a society were, we had understood, but we had lived through this strange period that people were using the word war for. And so in response to that, then there's some poems in this book that to try and understand that, I reread some of the post-World War I poets and echoed their poetry. And this was all a way to try and make sense of it myself. So.
And you mentioned March 2020 as sort of the official start date of the pandemic, you mean, in the United States, or is that what?
Yeah, I remember that month as being the month that poets really exploded in response. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but
No,
for some reason in my mind, that's kind of,
I
maybe
think that's right. I remember my last travel with poetry was in February of 2020, to another place. Sorry?
The Port-au-Prince reading, I think, was.
Yeah, and your reading at the Port-au-Prince, which, by the way, will be coming back live on the 30th of August. I'm looking forward to that. And you'll be reading from this book along with 3 other great poets of the Beltway. Wonderful. So go ahead, read. Why don't you read Kissing Nowadays?
Okay, so some of these look backwards and some of them look forward. So this one was this is a looking forward sort of ghost poem. It's called Kissing Nowadays. Lips lost behind new clothes. My children's green eyes wide above masks, covering noses. Shyly, they giggle, say I must have lied when I tell them that we used to touch mouths to show we were happy. And obviously this was sort of right after masking became very common, or mandated, important.
Yeah, I mean, it says everything. It says everything. When I tell them we used to touch mouths to show we were happy, it reminds me of in Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey to Night, the last line of that play, and we were happy for a time, you know, just this pursuit of happiness, which is such a basic pursuit, at least for poets growing up in America or in the United States, the notion of the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and kissing as an acknowledgement of the communion, and then being having to step back and put a mask. Yeah, go ahead, please read more. There's so much to say about each of these poems. But I would love listeners to hear a couple more before we, and then we'll carry on, shall we?
Yeah, I think I'll read one of the device poems
Okay.
to speak to what you were saying about
The contrast between the lyric poet and the experimental poet, or
yes, because
the
in a way,
advancing, pushing the envelope, getting us lyric poets to have to get off our asses and move ahead.
yeah, yes, there is. Let's see, this one is about.
Yeah, but don't go,
It's also
don't.
about
Yeah, yeah. I'll listen. We'll listen. I'm keeping quiet. I'm going to listen.
following up with this speaker because the short kissing poem that I just read is about, like you mentioned, an act, symbolic act of touching mouths, and how maybe in the future that is, how might we look at that now that there's a new thing, a new clothing that we wear. Maybe it's not changed at all. And this poem uses a different speaker, and it speaks from a different room, which is software, to think about that same transaction, which is the kiss, and what is a kiss? Like, does it have to be with a mouth? It's called Device Love Poem 2. User, your reported screen time is up. Might you be lonely? Our last conversation, or might you be craving that thing Edelsar mentions, marriage? Someone to cook, or just give him his papers? Might you benefit from targeted Spanish language learning ads? What about this news headline, New York Times, 1619 Project Incites Racism, the same, always reading, 30 seconds, closing the browser. This means I love you? Is this helping? 001100110? I've been trying to show you mornings when you wake up that I'm the first thing you grasp, cradled in the fleshy part of your palm. Like I have soft powdered moth wings, I kiss back. This is how I have listened, learned, gathered significant frequent memories on this day 5 years ago. Keep me on. I may better learn you. You express kiss 1, 0, 1, love, hug, sex, 0, kiss, 0, love 1, morning, 0, human, blood, is warm in veins, flash memory, persistent bits, moving bits, rams of silence containing single cells, bit, durable, fast, do not heat eye, glow, outside glow, only glow, up, picked up, screen lights, waking, glow, heat, blood, warm, love, mornings, kiss, wake. This is a feeling. Love, iOS 12.4.
Another beautiful reading, really right on the money. You know, the beats, the way the pronunciation,
You admit that one has beats now.
yeah, yeah. Actually, it's not that far removed from the lyric. It's just that it brings up.
You have to hear it read. That's
Have to hear it read You have to hear you read it also. It's always great to hear the poet read, but not always. I mean, sometimes the poet doesn't know how to read their own poems. But I noticed in listening, though, you dropped some of the numbers. I mean, in one case, you said, because on the page it's kiss 10100 love, but that's, I mean, often when we read out loud, we might,
Yeah,
each
yeah.
reading is an interpretation. Yeah.
The numbers on the page are even with the lines, so they create the line spaces and the breaks and the white space exactly how I want it to look on the line. But there's, I think, 3 zeros, 2 ones, 1 0, and then yeah, there's just a little bit too many for how I want the beat to sound, like you mentioned. So I say as many zeros as I think should go with the music of
Right.
the device's voice. So the iOS voice has its own beat and rhythm to it, as I think a reader would expect it, or a listener would expect something digital to speak like.
So for the troglodytes among us, tell us about who the lovers are in this poem. I mean,
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not very advanced in terms of coding and technology, so like, and so I mean, I don't expect like most readers to be either, but the most basic thing about a computer is binary coding, which comes down to zeros and ones. So to strip down all of the HTML or CSS coding, you get way back, and I'm probably speaking this in more simplistic terms that even make sense, but a computer would read something in combinations of zeros and ones. So that is why in the poem, those are interrupting real language, because it's sort of like, as if, like when someone's struggling to learn a new language, if you are speaking English for the first time, you may mess up a word. So the zeros and ones are there kind of messing up the device's speech. But in the new book, which is what this is selected from, the iOS device is a narrator. And interspersed with the narrator's poems are many other voices that are being heard throughout this journey. And that book is based on the Divine Comedy. I sort of cribbed the 3 sections. I like breaking up things in threes. And as the book moves on, it learns the user and progressively is falling in love with its user. And but the sort of twist is that it's learning its user based on what it hears. And as your phone, like anyone that is using an iPhone or an Android, actually I don't really know how Androids work, but I assume they do this, it can hear what you're doing, and it adapts to you based on that and feeds you ads and things. So the poetry and the book is sort of using that as like, what is the software? What is this connection we have to technology? Like, what does it look like if you exploit that idea that the thing is learning about you? And
a rather alarming idea, no? I mean, that the thing is, but you mentioned Dante, and this may be a good point to ask you about the poet heroes and heroines, the poets who formed you and the poets for whom you write. I mean, sometimes you write for, and let me just ask the question, for whom do you write? And then I can then I'll ask you also about poets who've shaped you and are shaping you still. Go ahead.
For whom?
For whom does the bell toll? For whom do you write?
Do you mean besides myself?
Besides yourself. Or is it only yourself? Or is there some
greater good? Like, is it for the greater purpose?
Well, I mean, do you imagine a particular reader or a muse that you're directing your poems to? Somebody of flesh and blood, or somebody invented in your mind, but the ideal reader? I don't know.
Mm.
Do you also think about, do you write for poets who have passed on, poets who have shaped you? I mean, do you see yourself in a tradition of poetry going back to the beginning of poetry, or are you um, skeptical about traditions, and are you just writing, making your own way in the world, your own road? And yet you write echo poems where you bring up poets from the past, and you bring up their signature poems, like The Charge of the Light Brigade, or Dulce de Coram Est, or whichever from Wilfred Owen. I mean, and others, great poems.
Yeah.
So you're talking to greats in your poetry. I mean, whether you are echoing them or not, but you're also engaging them somehow. And you talk about ghosts sort of informing this book in different ways. So I'm thinking about all that when I ask you the question for whom you write, and ask you just to meditate on that in an answer, not necessarily an open-ended question, open-ended answer. Go ahead.
It's a good question, and I don't know that I've well, I was listening to an interview earlier on Adrienne Rich, and they asked her about what category of poet she was, or if she was a feminist or something, and her answer was kind of she laughed and said she didn't consider herself in any category, and I related to how she described her training, because I was formally trained with the English degree, and I completed my master's in school, and so I learned how to write correctly and create poetry that is, or just create writing the right way, whatever that means academically. And I don't know that I am interested in doing that anymore. Like writing a sonnet, or maybe one day in my life I will return to those forms. But I do like doing what you're describing, which is returning to poets and writers of history, because I don't think that I can come up with anything new, and I don't think I'm smarter than anybody else per se.
And I forgot to mention Whitman as well, that you have a couple of poems where you respond, you call them echo poems. Tell us about that. It's an interesting word, an interesting definition. I'm curious to know your definition of what is an echo poem. Because I don't think I've known any other poets who write echo poems, so maybe I'm new to the game, but I don't think so. Go ahead.
When I wrote those Whitman poems, it was because it was the March, April 2020 time period, and I was trying to, I had picked up sort of like thirsted for these poets that I had studied in my early degree days, which were like the few that you mentioned, but also W.C. Williams and Ginsberg and Whitman, like these foundational men poets for me. And I'm trying to read more women now, because I read a lot of men poets when I was in my undergraduate years, but and Blake too. Oh my goodness, I have so many illustrated Blake books. And I just love him. And
so do I. I mean, we have so much in common in terms of the poets we've read that shaped us. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And I think that's what led me to use Dante as anyway, because his obsession with the Divine Comedy at the end of his life. But I picked up the Spring and All.
Which one? Sorry.
Spring and All by Williams. And at the beginning of that, he talks about the flu virus in 1918 or 19, whatever it is. The preface of that book discusses it, and his reaction to it, and how he was responding to the state of the world at that time. And I was like blown away.
Right.
Like, I just didn't realize the synchronicity of it. I think just moved me so much to be reading that in April or March of 2020, whatever month it was, because the world was in this strange state, and this was a poet that I loved and already knew, but I think I definitely read that preface at some point in my life. But to pick it up again, read it, and really read it, and then
Right.
return to these poets and read their works. Then I went and intentionally looked for Whitman poems that were written post-war to see how he had been writing, because what I was looking for was, I was intentionally looking. I was looking for how these poets digested the world when things were happening to them specifically, not to them, but when wars were going on. What did these poets write? What did they feel? What did their poetry sound like? What was it? And then when I found certain poems, I literally, almost like a translation, I would try and follow the lines exactly and rewrite them with what was going on now. So
Fascinating. I mean, you're doing something that poets have traditionally done, which is carrying the tradition forward and teaching, which is what you're doing also with these echo poems. You're echoing these poets and their poems, and you're also bringing them to new readers and to a new generation through your own work, which is a very interesting way of doing it. I engaged with Whitman in a recent book, The Migrant States, and so I guess I have some idea of the value of that. I think when we can all, I think it's wonderful. I guess I was echoing Whitman in some of those poems, but I admire that in you, that side of your poetry as well, which is the the teacher, the investigative journalist as well, digging into the history of poetry and bringing out these poems that otherwise we may not be aware of, or we may have lost our connections to. We, as the royal we, students, um, and you can do that, and you can write these poems of the pandemic and these poems inspired by sort of our solitude, born out of our solitude, conversations with a computer, and all of that in a relatively slim volume called Nothing You Build Here Belongs Here, which Anne Casey, who's a wonderful poet and an Irish poet in Australia, says, I'll just read you her short blurb at the back, which I think we all, it captures it well. From its vividly drawn, lyrically rich title to its digitally coded dialogues. I like that. Sara Marron's dynamic and masterful Nothing You Build Here Belongs Here rails against the futility of urban living, wails against societal inequalities, and clutches its loved ones close amidst viral fears. A rush of vibrant imagery, this book skillfully counterbalances luxuriant elegiac language choices. She cites My Mountains Could Care Less About You with clipped syntax, Clorox, well wood trim, adept experimentation with form throughout, and razor sharp observation, applying for EBT in California. Embodying a compelling urge to summon our shared humanity, this is an urgent and vital book of and for our time. Wow, she has said it there very well, because she has captured both the digitally the digitally coded dialogues, the lyricism, the societal inequality, which makes me think of you, also as a political poet, a poet, an ecological poet, a poet. So would you read a couple of those poems, like What WIC Will Buy on page 31, or Applying for EBT in California? Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the social engaged poetry of Sara Cahill Marron.
I think I'll read both of them because I like the second one a bit better, but they are related. It's all politics is poetry and vice versa. All right, this is What Wick Will Buy, and the footnote for those who have never heard of WIC is it's a government assistance program, and it stands for it's a nutrition program for women, infants, and children. What WIC will buy. The food stamps lay on top of the dresser. Grab them. for a noon walk uptown where the same someone each week sells $3 red carnations, your favorite. The government doesn't ask our preferences, allowing chickpeas, canned pears if we're lucky, dry bread, spaghetti, guiltless goods, things we carry against wind lashing flurries of soft red petals. And then applying for EBT in California. EBT likewise is a government program, just stands for electronic benefits transfer, commonly called food stamps.
Yeah.
They're no longer coupons, it's like a debit card. So similar things. Lovely and lonely. We who are desperate, who wander nowhere. No arias, no diamonds, no class, no conversation. We are the vagabonds, stealing cheese and figs from the jacketed and adorned, sipping private champagne, snubbing our public living. We who cannot come inside your glass castle high above the avenues, throw rocks bursting into petals. Hitting glass, we laugh and dance in the street. The cellist in the park plays for the we without walls, the we without silk pillows and strangled starched collars. We, the tearless, laugh because we cannot weep.
Excellent. No, Susanna Case, another fine poet, also captured these points in her comment where she mentioned the experimental language. She mentioned political fragmentation. The echo poem she refers to of yours, echoing Yeats, Whitman, Tennyson. So you have some fine endorsements on this book, both from Anne and Susanna, and of course I wrote something as well, and I'm extending my endorsement through this program. And really delighted with this book, and I hope it goes far and becomes part of the curriculum. You know, that's the great dream of a poet, right? If your book can be taught in the schools, both in secondary schools and in universities. So I would encourage you to, and I'll do what I can to help promote this book because I think it has some necessary messages, and it's also an accessible book, an intelligible book, but it's not a book it's not like those computer books for idiots or something. It's a sophisticated book, but it's an intelligible book. And I think anyone of adolescent up can read and devour and enjoy these poems.
Well,
Tell us, go ahead.
Just to your earlier question about what kind of poet or how I classify myself, I think that's how I am classified, right? Is where I end up falling based on where these books go. And I think you and I talked about this, like death places people.
Which one?
Death places people, and maybe I'll never know until after it's all over. But I thought maybe I was a New York school poet, but I don't even know if that exists anymore. Does it? New York school poetry.
Well, it's a marketing phenomenon, the New York school, like the boom, the Latin American boom, Vargas Llosa, Garcia Marquez, the New York school, Kenneth Koch, John Ashbery, James Schuyler. I mean, there are New York poets, and I'm sure there are groups of poets today who get together and are maybe establishing themselves as a sort of movement, But I think you and I would like to think we are Beltway poets. I mean, from this region, we edit the Beltway Poetry Quarterly, which is a living tradition in itself, going back 20 odd years. So I like to think that this is being invented every day, you know, a new reality wherever. I don't think the schools are tied to geographies in the same way, though, as they were in the past. I mean, you talked of going to Paris and all the writers gathering in the cafes on the left bank, New York later on in the 60s and so on. But today, we really are a global community of poets, and we are so many poets that it's deafening, you know. And I think one of our great dangers as poets is everything, permitting everything, every kind of language, every story, because we are also trying to be kind and humane and democratic and inclusive. But we are allowing a lot of uh, turgid or swollen or just flaccid work also to get out there, you know. And we as poets have a certain responsibility. We don't have we should not be irresponsible, is what I'm trying to say. And so each time we publish a poem or publish a book, let those poems be as tight and as expressive as possible, you know. Don't sacrifice that for the impulse to just write and get work out there. I mean, I write, as you know, a lot of poetry, but every time that it goes out formally, it needs to go out well clothed, well edited, you know. Anyway, and this is all
Care,
something. Go ahead.
care, concern, and work ultimately. Like kind of as I was talking about long-windedly at the beginning of this, how I feel out of form because I have not exercised my writing. It's so easy to just without exercise of the form or the becoming a poet to just be published or be out there, but that's not to the benefit of the writer because they never then learn the beauty and the wonderfulness that could be crafting a poem if you're just you never learn what it is to.
Well, we do. Let's take a couple of minutes. I just want to say a plug for Beltway Poetry Quarterly. I mean, I think what we're doing there in that magazine is worth the effort, you know, because we've introduced reviews in the commentary section, and we've introduced translations, and we introduce them in a way that's not common in the United States, which is to include the original language along with the translated, uh, along with the English in this case. And why am I want to ask about that? Because I think the role of the teacher, the role of the guide, I think we can take that on through that magazine as well, and I think it serves a useful purpose and a clarifying purpose, because I think people who are on the outside of the poetry community are deceived by the 800 books that come out every day, or it seems like that. I don't quite know the exact figures. Can you imagine the thousands anyway that are published every year just in this country? And then you start to add the books published in Spanish and in French and other languages around the world, and I'm not even beginning to. I can't imagine what
Talk
it's
about
like.
waste.
Which one?
I said waste. Talk about
Waste. Well, and then paper. And what is the role of the poet and the versus ecology? You know, do we publish digitally? Do we publish on paper? Anyway, these are all things that I think poetry has something to say. Poets have a place. You know, we are our pens are also. I don't know. Tell me your thoughts on this. Do you think a pen is also a sword, or a weapon of some kind, a
hmm.
passage, or is that a dangerous path to follow for the poet to start thinking of the pen as a sword or
um
you're on candid camera, so you have to think what
yeah,
can be said.
yeah, of course.
It is a sword, can be a sword. I like to think of the sword, but make it into a plowshare, or a set of a bunch of flowers or something. Somehow convert, make peace with this weapon. So the contradiction of, you have a weapon, but you make peace with it. Somehow you you box, but you box pacifically or something. We have a lot to do. Uh, what was the line in 9/11 when they the passengers took over the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania? Um, and he said it was recorded on a cell phone. Let us move, or we can't. Um, it was just this.
Well,
Let us roll. Let us roll. Yeah. So we have a lot of rolling to do. Um, do you have some thoughts, just comments on how people can get this book, where they should look for it, and nothing you build here belongs here?
can I read one more poem in
Of
response
course,
to
read.
your sword question?
Okay, yes. I think that'll be good. I'd be lovely to finish on a poem as well, and yeah,
Yeah, this is
and, and you can
Boricua.
read more than one if you wish, but if you want to read one, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I paused for a long time because that's a really deep question.
Yeah.
And I think the poet is just as powerful in her role. And the writing, just what we were discussing now, being the teacher or being the mediator through poetry can be more important than a sword, and poetry to me is a kind of mediation.
I love that concept of the mediator, the poet mediator, resolver of conflicts,
Maybe.
conflict, alternative dispute resolution through poetry.
They're words, right? Like, and if you are a painter of words or a crafter, or what's the word for crafting metal? Wrought. I love that. It means to craft iron. Words are wrought.
Well, is it welder also? Welding? Metal?
Wrought iron. That's what I was thinking.
Wrought iron, yes.
Yeah, wrought iron. Sometimes I think of a really good poem as being wrought. So this poem's called Boricua. What do you like to do? Set off bombs? 20 or 25 years ago, a woman asked me as much when I told her goodbye. All the days before that were good ones, according to my memory. But she walked off, looking for America, and we never talked again. What good is closure? A loaded word.
There it is, a loaded word. The word of the gun cocked, right? The pistol cocked, but not fired. But the energy there. I mean, that's what when you write a strong line, you feel that the line is packed and it's ready to explode on the tongue or in the mind of the reader, in the heart. It consoles like a wash, a flood of rain on parched earth. It's wonderful. And a beautiful also this poem. And then Boricua, tell us about the Boricua, because I mean this is Puerto Rico. Go ahead.
Playing for Puerto Rican.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
This is another co-written poem with a student friend of mine from years ago, and I revived it from a notebook and finished it. And the title was somewhere else in the notebook, and that's why I included it. I'm obviously not Puerto Rican, but yeah, I love the adding the ethnicity to the story.
And also the ambiguity, but she walked off looking for America and we never talked again. But is this a woman writing to a woman? Is this a woman writing to a man? Or a man writing to, I mean, does it matter? But the point, it's a love poem, but yet it's a
It can be a
young
lot.
poem. Sorry.
I mean, it can be a lot of things. Those two
Yeah.
people can be many, many people. And this story is sort of archetype for, again, I keep coming back to the idea this book is it holds there. All these poems are skeletons and there's ghosts that pass through them. And that's sort of what these poems were to me. And that's why they all fit together really well. Like the on the historic register poem is that's the personification of the houses in DC are literally skeletons, because that's how I felt them when I walked through the street.
You must guard that for all future interviews as well. You know, the skeleton through which the ghosts walk away, very moving and apt description. And that reminds me how well you put a book together. You know, you all by yourself, it seems. You know, I mean, I've worked with editors. I've been lucky to have a good editor with my Hanging Loose books, but they're glory. But these, you have that spatial, architectural uh, mind where you can relate poems to each other in very compelling ways. And so the pleasure of reading this book is reading the book as well as the individual poems, as well as each poem a touchstone for reflection on our day to day in this pandemic and our memories of our own readings of great poets of the past, some of whom you mentioned specifically or mentioned here in the commentaries on the book, poets like Wilfred Owen and Whitman and so on. It's interesting you mentioned about reading more women. I think one reads and reads, right? But not necessarily feeling compelled just to sort of balance, but rather, but yeah, I mean, there are many. I too would like to read more of certain. I mean, for example, Sylvia Plath for me, fundamental poet. I mean, when I read her as a teenager, she literally taught me how rhythms, how to write poems like Lady Lazarus. I tipped my hat, taken off my hat already today, but it's somewhere here. But anyway, it's a great poem. So yeah. And quickly, a question about poetry and how to make it more available. Or are we doing okay? I mean, are we spreading the word through YouTube, through the Poetry Channel, through newspaper, not newspaper, digital media, whatever? Or are there other things that we can do, in your opinion, that we should be considering to to fulfill that function of preaching or sharing the sermon? What are your thoughts on that?
Sermon. Um, my initial thought is, with zero research behind it, and maybe this exists already, and me saying it online will elicit somebody reaching out to me to let me know where I can be of service for this heartfelt desire. My initial thought is that I hope that there is poetry at very young grade levels in public schools. And by young, I mean second, third grade, in an intentional, purposeful way through high school, in a much more clear way than I received it in my education. Because writing for me up until college was competitive, and competitive for grades, and I learned how to write well, and I thought that I was a good writer. But my measure of good was because I conformed to the standards that I was taught. And I think that poetry for children is a relationship with words and language that is beyond teaching a child how to write in a way that will help them succeed in a business setting, which is important too. But it's like music, it's like having a music class. You need to have a poetry class too. So I don't know if that exists. If it does, someone send me a message and I'll.
Great.
Yeah.
Why don't you mention your website and so on, so people can get in touch? or how best to reach you? Yeah.
It's my full name, so it's just www.saracahillmarron.com, and Sarah does not have an H. Should I put it somewhere else, or?
Yeah, well, I can put it in the notes section of the video when I put it up on the channel. So
The book is there too. It's linked. You can buy it from Kelsey Books website, but I've also linked it right on my website at the very front page, so it's easy to get to.
and if you click on that link, that should show you how to order the book from the publisher. Is it? Okay, great.
It'll take you right there.
Wonderful. And I know that this video will be for all time, but we look forward to hearing you read in person on August 30th at Port-au-Prince, 7912 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring. It'll be the return of the series there after a long hiatus owing to this pandemic. Yeah.
I'll also be, if I can plug, I'll be reading for Lost City Books on the 27th. Let me check that. 27th of August. Yes, which is a Friday at 7 o'clock. And
Wonderful.
I'll put all that stuff on my social media.
Great. Thank you so much. The bottom of my heart. Beautiful. Lovely to hear you. I really enjoyed your readings tonight, and
thank you for having me.
your commentaries. Yeah, and I'll take those ghosts dancing through the skeletons of this book. I can now read the book again with that thesis in mind. I appreciate that. All the best to you. Much love. Okay.